So as we say, we're going to run through the new SSP reforms with you today, as they're called, which is the changes that the government have made to statutory sick pay. So a lot of changes that have come in this month, and some sort of best practice and some tips that we'll give you as to how to manage those and to make sure that you're compliant. So what we'll look at in this session will be what the changes are to SSP. So to give you a run through of what the changes are, and what you need to be aware of. We will have a look at how you can manage those changes internally, so what they mean practically for your businesses. We'll look at why it's important in general to manage sickness and just some stats around how much of a problem sickness is in the UK at the moment. There is some different support that's available, which we'll cover with you. A quick run through of the stages of sickness, so the informal and formal stages, and different things that can affect people's absence levels at work as well. So to look at why people are off sick, which is really important when you're trying to manage it, to understand the background sometimes. We will have a look at some commonly used calculations. So one of the questions we get asked quite a lot is, how do we know sickness is too high? How do we know it's causing a problem? So we'll have a look at a couple of different ways that you can have a look at that. We'll have a look at the Disability Discrimination Act, or the Equal Opportunities Act as it's known. And then we'll touch briefly on reasonable adjustments, and look specifically in sort of quick detail at pregnancy and mental ill health, because they are areas that sometimes have separate rules or separate ways of managing them. I'm just going to try and remove this box from my screen, which I don't think is moving. So just ignore that at the top. That won't affect the slides. So changes to absence management under the Employment Rights Bill. So like we said, there's lots of changes that have come about under the Employment Rights Bill, or the Employment Rights Act. The biggest changes come in last week, so hopefully you're already aware of them. If not, if you've got any questions, please use this session to get yourselves familiar. So the first change is that the 3 unpaid waiting days have now been removed, which means statutory sick pay is payable from the first day of absence. So previously, people would have 3 days unpaid before SSP kicked in. Now, any sickness, even if it's only 1 day of sickness, qualifies for SSP. The rate is at £123.25 a week, so it's not a huge amount of money, but it is 3 extra days that you need to pay that you wouldn't have paid before. The bigger change around sickness is around the lower earnings limit, or the LEL as it's often referred to. Now, previously, under the pre-April legislation, people had to earn £125 a week in order to qualify for sick pay. And if they didn't earn £125 a week, then sickness was unpaid. The biggest change that's come in under the Employment Rights Bill is statutory sick pay is now SSP or 80% of wages, and it's paid at the lower of the two. So if you have a member of staff, for example, who earns £100 for working 2 days a week for you, in the old days, they wouldn't have got paid if they went sick, because they wouldn't have met that lower earnings limit qualification. Now they will get 80% of their pay. So their wages for coming to work that week would be 100%. Their wage for being sick that week would be 80%. So that is a really big financial cost that you need to be aware of, that previously would not have applied to your company. That obviously is now an issue. So for those of you that budget for sick pay, not only do you need to budget to cover those 3 waiting days, you also need to budget for the people who previously wouldn't have earned sick pay at all. So they're sort of the biggest 2 changes that have come in. Like we say, remember it's the lower of the 2, so it will be the lower of the SSP or the 80%. Now, the rationale from the government behind those changes is that they want it to do 2 things. So to provide financial security for lower earners, and to prevent the spread of illness in the workplace. Now, there's a lot of concerns at the moment that people cannot afford to go sick. We're in a position in the country, obviously, cost of living is increasing and people need to go to work. And it's felt that at the moment, the lower earners, who are the people who previously wouldn't have got any sick pay, perhaps were those who were under greater pressure to go in, therefore spreading illness at work. So that's the aims of the sickness changes under the Employment Rights Bill. Now, what steps can you take as a company? So we've talked about your reviewing processes ready for it. Like I say, in reality, it came in last week. So hopefully these reviews have happened, but if they haven't, there's still time. Carry out a return to work interview for every single absence. So you need to get yourselves into the culture and the mindset as a company of, if somebody's off sick, they have a return to work. Now, this is really important for 2 reasons. So first of all, it lets you understand why they're off, to understand what was wrong, and more importantly, to understand they're okay to be coming back. So in terms of absence management and well-being, It's really important that you know that about your staff, that they're now fit to be back at work. The other reason that it's really important to do them, and we'll look at this in a little while, is it's inevitable that out of these changes, sickness rates probably will increase. Yeah, I'll cover that in a second, Georgina. It's very likely that sickness rates will increase. And I think having that process and those forms, that every time somebody's off sick, you fill in a form with them, you look back over their previous sickness, you can spot any trends, any patterns, any concerns, gives you a much better and a much more kind of hands-on approach to be able to manage that proactively. We just had a quick question in the chat about, does that also apply to half days or part days? That's very much a company decision. I would say yes. I think doing a return to work after any absence is a good practice to get into. You may well find that you've got a member of staff who has a pattern of taking a half a day sickness every couple of weeks or half a day sickness on a Friday. So it may still identify either ill health and is there something that's causing them to sort of burn out by the end of the week, or it may identify other reasons, that perhaps that sickness is masking something else going on. So it's probably good practice, but the full days are probably the ones to really, really focus on. We've got a form, so if anybody hasn't got a return to work interview form and you need one, let us know. It's quite simple. It's just that conversation, but it just creates that sort of culture where it's quite normal to do them. The next thing is to think about your recording and your data. So, like we say, if sickness rates are likely to increase, that means on the back of that, you're likely to need to take action to decrease them again. And to do that, you need to understand when people are off and why people are off. Now, we often get people who will phone up and say, I've got a member of my team whose absence is too high. And when we say, well, how high is it? They'll say, well, I don't know the figures, but it's definitely too high. That's really hard to manage with your team. So have your recording, have your data, have sort of dates and times, so that you know who is off and when they're off and why they're off. Managing triggers and trends, like we say, if you've got somebody that's prone to having a Monday off sick, for example, you will want to address that with them at some point. It may be that you've got people who go off sick when there's a big project on at work, and perhaps it's work pressures that are causing sickness. You might find staff who have more sickness in the school holidays. And that's not necessarily to say the sickness isn't genuine, because it could be leading to kind of anxiety or other concerns. But I think having those trends that you can look at and say, this is what the issue is, this is why people are off, makes it much, much easier to deal with. Managers training is really important. For some of yourselves, you may be the manager, others may be sort of the director that's delegating it, but make sure that anybody that is managing absence has got the tools and the confidence to be able to manage it properly. So being able to ask the right questions, being able to fill in the form consistently, all of those things are really important. So do think about your training for managers. It might just be running through sort of best practice with them. You might want to do that through sort of mentoring or coaching, or you might want us to hold like a manager's absence training session for you. So lots of different ways to do that, but don't just assume that people are okay to manage these things. So what effect might the changes have? As we said a moment ago, the biggest changes likely to come is that there probably will be an increase in absence levels. Now, whether that's because people that previously couldn't afford to be off sick now can, or whether it's because the payments, are now there to make it easier for people to come off. The other change is that there may now be a very small difference in wages and sick pay for these lower earners. So the people who aren't earning the LEL limit, like we said earlier, if they're earning £100 a week for coming in or £80 a week for being off, there may not be a massive difference between those wages. And that may lead to an increase in difficult conversations. As managers, you're likely to be dealing with more sickness cases now, more return to work interviews now, more conversations around managing performance and absence, and the knock-on effects of that. So for yourself as a direct impact on your company, this is going to take you more time. These conversations, these return to works need to happen. And then just looking at some of the just the stats around this. So 43% of workers have said that the removal of the waiting days will have the biggest impact on them out of all of the employment rights bills changes. Now, when you think of all the things that are coming in around increases to pay, increases to family leave, the short service protection, nearly half of people think that this is going to be the biggest impact for them personally. 36% of workers felt that this was the biggest positive impact of the change. So a third of people are kind of welcoming these changes as well. And they're just some figures that have come out of an ACAS study this year. So as you can see, this is something that is being well received, understandably, by staff, but it's causing a lot of concern for businesses. So, why is it important to manage sickness absence? There's lots of things that come from not managing it. Reduction in productivity, obviously, is the main one. You know, if your staff aren't there, they can't be performing. There is an effect on morale, and sometimes that can affect the people who aren't off sick. You know, very often sickness problems come from those left behind that feel that they're carrying the weight of their colleagues, or they're taking on more responsibility. There's obviously financial implications, like I say, the cost of sick pay, the cost of training, the cost of covering roles. Um, Around cover, that's another consideration that a lot of customers are saying to us is, well, previously, if somebody who was under the lower earnings limit was off sick, they didn't get paid at all. And therefore, that money was available to cover them with somebody else. Now that they are getting paid 80%, you may not have the money to cover them. So it's also just thinking around how you cover your own staffing levels. All of that obviously affects your customer service, continuity of service and how you service the customers. And there is an underlying kind of message through all of this about employee well-being, making sure people are okay, making sure people are looked after, and not to kind of fall into the trap yourself of assuming that everybody that's off sick is abusing the system, because clearly that isn't true. But it's having the processes to identify where support is needed and where action is needed. And a lack of workforce, as we said a moment ago, if your staff aren't in, then they're not working, they're not servicing the customers, contracts perhaps aren't being met. So lots of different issues that can arise. I'll do this slide around transitional arrangements, and I'll just see if anybody's got any questions at all around the changes for this year before we go on to the sort of general training. So one of the biggest questions I think on everybody's mind is what happens to people who cross over the 6th of April? What the government have said is that if the 3 unpaid waiting days occurred before the 6th of April, they won't be paid. So if somebody was off sick, say on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, then that wouldn't be paid and they'll just be paid as normal from day 4. But if they cross over, then they will be paid. So if somebody was only off sick on the 5th, that would be unpaid because it was before the 6th. But the 6th and 7th will now fall into the new regime, so they will become paid days. So you may have some staff who transition across that 6th of April date. Any employees who are already off sick before the 6th of April who would receive less under the new 80% rule are also protected. So the kind of underlying message here is people may be financially better off for crossing over, but they shouldn't be worse off. So if you're not sure with any staff at all what you should be paying them if they've crossed over that date, just let us know, or let your accountants or your payroll know. And obviously we can just make sure that you apply that properly. Any employees will remain on the old flat rate of £123.25 until they return to work, exhaust their 28-week limit, or their contract ends. So people who their 80% of pay takes them below the new rate of SSP will carry on the lower of the two for that whole period. So you may have some people who have 28 weeks of SSP, which is now lower at their 80% of wages than it would be at their SSP rate. It's quite hard to kind of understand. So the biggest thing I would say is if you get a case, let us know and we can discuss an actual case with you. Enforcement of SSP will be handled by the Fair Work Agency. Now, Fair Work Agency come into effect on the 7th of April, so the day after all of these changes. We have had a lot of conversations with staff around the Fair Work Agency. So for those of you that are on our mailing list or have been to other lunch and learns, you will have heard us talking about them. They are basically a government body who will now have the authority to audit and sanction companies. Now, they don't need to audit and sanction on the back of a complaint. They can just audit and sanction because you're identified as a company and they come out and audit you. They will be able to check anything. They'll be able to check your sickness records, your staff records, your right to work checks. They'll be able to check holiday. And obviously it's not a holiday session, but for those of you that aren't on the mailing list, there was a big change to holiday last week, which now requires you to keep 6 years worth of holiday and annual leave records. So if you're not aware of any of these changes, let us know and we can talk you through them. But the Fair Work Agency could literally turn up and ask to see your records and do an audit there and then. If you don't pass that inspection, they can fine and sanction on behalf of the government. So do kind of be aware of the importance of keeping your paperwork, keeping your records and keeping everything up to date. We just got a quick question in the chat about how long the new SSP will be paid for. It will still be the 28 weeks. So there's no change to the SSP times at all. The other thing that there's no change to, which we'll look at in a moment, is people being able to self-cert. So your staff can still self-cert for 7 days and they still don't need a medical note till day 8 onwards. So there could be a lot of people who are potentially self-certing for a day or two, being paid without ever seeing a GP. So just sort of be aware of those. We've got a couple of questions in the chat about return to work forms and slides. We will pop them around afterwards. If you haven't got them or you want to just send us over a quick email to remind us that you want them, that's absolutely fine. Sam, can you try and make a note of the people that have asked for them in the chat?
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
fine. Also, just to add, I've already put the return to work form in the chat so they can download directly from there.
brilliant. There you go. Sam's well on the ball. um, the SSP, yes, it is a rolling 28 weeks. So once somebody hits 28 weeks in a rolling 12-month period, it does reset. So it's 28 weeks. Then if they return to work, it kind of resets again and rolls on the 28 week in 12-month structure. So there's no changes at all to the payment of SSP under these rules. Okay. So how much of a problem is sickness absence anyway? Why are we talking about these things? Why does it matter? So sickness is currently at its highest rate in 15 years. And it's currently averaging across the UK at 9.4 days per employee per year. So it's nearly 2 weeks per member of staff on a full-time basis per year at the moment. Pre-pandemic, so going back about 6 years ago, it was at 5.8 days. So it's doubled in the last 6 years. So just some sort of stats there to kind of put into context, if you picture every one of your staff being off for 2 weeks a year just through sickness, on top of that, you've got obviously your annual leave and your other absences, it is having a really big impact on staffing levels. So different types of sickness. So just to give you a really quick run through. So short-term sickness tends to be up to 4 weeks, and it's mainly for minor illnesses. So people have got a cold, a flu, a throat infection. Generally speaking, your short-term illness is a one-off. So it's not normally related to an ongoing condition, or if it is, then it would be expected that you would know that as a nature of that condition, somebody may be off sick with it. Long-term sickness tends to be over 4 weeks in length. So once somebody hits a month of sickness, we tend to class them as being off long-term. And very often that's where it's connected to more serious illnesses, disabilities, long-term ill health. And very often that's reoccurring or requiring ongoing treatment. So somebody might be off for a long time, perhaps for an operation or, some kind of treatment. And as we said a moment ago, there's no changes under these rules for self-certification. So employees can still self-certificate for 7 days and they need a doctor's note from day 8 onwards. Now, it's important to remember that they're calendar days, not working days. So if somebody only works 2 days a week, they can still only self-cert for that first 7 calendar days. And then they would need a doctor's note for anything after that. Um, Doctor's notes can be issued from a number of people now. So you might have seen the changes last year. Obviously, they can still be issued by GPs and hospitals, but there's also a lot of pharmacies that are issuing doctor's notes, some opticians, some sort of general nurses. So you may see doctor's notes coming in from lots of different places. All doctor's notes that are issued will have a QR code on the bottom. So we tend to say people scan it, just verify that it's genuine. There's lots online about how to identify fraudulent or fake sick notes. But if ever you get one that you're in any doubt, just refer to the government guidelines, just scan the code, make sure it's obviously all above board. And then some different things that can affect absence levels. So lots of different things that can affect, why people are off. So obviously the most obvious one is illness and ill health. Physical conditions, so sometimes sort of physical symptoms that a person has can mean that they're off sick. Mental ill health we'll look at a little bit later, but that is an increasing issue, an increasing reason for absence. There are stats at the moment that show that around 1 in 4 adults are or will experience mental ill health at some point in their working lives. So, a really high percentage of people that may be off with those reasons. Sometimes people can be off because of external factors, so kind of short-term stress or anxiety, which might be caused by bereavement, by divorce, by a house move. Addiction is something that's coming up more and more. I mean, I think we've supported with more addiction cases over the last 12 months than at any other point. And obviously addiction can be lots of different things. So drugs, alcohol, gambling, very often may result in referrals to kind of third parties to support with that. Sometimes people are off with sports related or hobby related injuries. Workplace accidents obviously can lead to time off. Sometimes workplace relationships, so relationship breakdowns, conflict, bullying, all of those kind of things that make somebody not want to come in. And pressures at work. Like we say, very often the trends that are spotted from a return to work interview are around absence falling at perhaps a certain time of the year or a certain project. Domestic abuse is another area that quite rightly is receiving a lot of, a lot of kind of discussion, and companies are much more aware of the effects of domestic abuse and obviously the knock-on effects they have on things like attendance. And, we can't do an absence management session without talking about the non-genuine sickness. So there are occasions where people will perhaps phone in sick when their own children are ill. And we come across that a lot. And the rationale is often, well, I get paid, for being off sick, but if I'm off my children, it's unpaid. And that may sort of put that temptation there for people to present with reasons that aren't 100% genuine. So lots of different things, as you can see, that affect it. And if you think about your own teams or your own kind of personal lives, they're all things that will come up at some point. Hopefully not all of them for everybody, but they're inevitably things that you will come across. Now, as I said earlier, probably the most commonly asked question we get is, well, we know their sickness is high, but is it too high? There's a couple of different ways that you can monitor sickness levels yourself. So some companies will work on a kind of triggers basis, which is where you have sometimes it's written in your handbook, sometimes a bit more of an unwritten rule, but of what level of absence do you feel is acceptable? And the kind of figures that are often used there are 3 occasions in 3 months or 5 occasions in 12. Other companies will use the Bradford factor, which is a really well-known method of calculating. And as you can see there, it goes on a formula of S times D. So the S is the spells or the occasions, and the D is the number of days. So if somebody had perhaps one occasion of sickness, which was 5 days long, their formula would be 1 times 1 times 5. If they had 10 occasions over the last year that were all 2 days each, it would be 10 times 10 times 2. And that will give you a physical kind of number, which you can then use as kind of your method. And very often that goes along the lines which are a bit more structured than the triggers, where if you hit a certain number, you'll be called to a first written warning meeting. If you hit another number, you'll be called to a second meeting. So have a think yourselves what you use. If you don't and you want to introduce anything just kind of in the background to help your managers manage this, the triggers can often be quite a good place to start because it just kind of gives you that informal sort of method of calculating. And then a quick look at the Equality Act, Disability Discrimination Act. So the Equality Act says that you are disabled if you have a physical or mental impairment that has a substantial and long-term effect on your ability to carry out normal daily activities. Now, there is no clear definition of substantial and long-term. Very helpfully, substantial is detailed as being more than minor or more than trivial. So the general rule of thumb is more than you would expect, more serious than you would expect the average impact to be, or the average sort of person to have. Long-term means 12 months or more. So very often people are diagnosed with something like potentially asthma or COPD or some kind of heart condition, which they're going to have for life. They would then be covered under the Equality Act because the prognosis is 12 months or more, and it will have an effect on their day-to-day living. There are certain rules and certain conditions that are exempt from this classification. So things like progressive conditions that get worse over time, like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, any kind of cancer, HIV or multiple sclerosis as well is classified as covered under DDA from the point of diagnosis. So just kind of be aware that if you do have staff that are classed as disabled for one of these reasons, or who have an ongoing health condition, it's very likely they will be covered under the Disability Discrimination Act. Now, what that means in practice is that they have got the legal right to request reasonable adjustments to work. So those adjustments might come in through GP or GP sort of fit notes, doctor's notes. They might come in through occupational health referrals, sometimes expert services, a consultant or a physio, and sometimes they'll come from the individual themselves, just telling you what they need. If you get any of these individuals who have got any kind of health needs at all, it's always good practice to do a risk assessment and kind of look at what they need and what support is required. And remember that the adjustments could be to do with anything. So it might be to do with their hours, their workload, their working location, the number of breaks they have, or it could be role specific where they can't do a certain part of the role because of their condition. Now, it's really important to remember that the law says you have to consider reasonable adjustments. It doesn't say you have to implement them. So we always say to people, remember that what's reasonable for one business might not be reasonable for another. A very big business could potentially incorporate one of these much, much easier than a small company that perhaps isn't as cash rich. So do a risk assessment, consider the adjustments, consult with your people around what they need and what impact it would have. But look at it as a kind of individual basis as to what they're asking for and whether that can be accommodated. We just had a quick question in the chat. Somebody can't see the slides. Can everybody see them? If anyone can't, just let us know.
Actually, they're showing on mine, but it could be that because there's so many people on the call, that you might need to move sideways to get the slides up.
Oh, okay. Is anyone else having trouble seeing them? We'll carry on. If anyone can't see them, if you want to join and leave and rejoin, we'll obviously let you straight back in. It might just need to clear on the screen, as Sam said. But if anyone's got any trouble, let us know. Um, a couple of quite specific things just to cover. So pregnancy is one of the areas where you normally do need to make adjustments to absence reporting. So any pregnancy related absence is normally discounted in terms of monitoring absence figures. It's really important to remember that if somebody is off with pregnancy related absence in the 4 weeks before childbirth, that will automatically start their maternity leave. So keep a note on any sickness or any doctor's notes that come in during pregnancy, and make sure if you need to start things, you're on top of those dates and figures. And then a couple of slides now on mental ill health, and then we'll open up for questions if anybody's got any. So it's really important to remember that everybody has mental health. All of us have good mental health or poor mental health, and that can change throughout life. The definition there talks about it being a state of well-being which can fluctuate. You're not always going to be unwell, and you're not always going to be well. It's an ever-changing kind of condition. Um, Lots of things can affect somebody's mental ill health, which ultimately will affect their mood, their thinking, their behaviour, and how everybody responds to pressures and how everybody responds to their own kind of mental health challenges is very unique. So we always say to people, look at the risk factors. All of these things will affect people in different ways. So things like poor health and safety policies, communication, leadership, opportunities for progression or training. Look at people's flexibility, in flexible working, how much sort of autonomy do they have over what they do? Obviously, keep an eye on people's workloads, consider their skill set, can they actually do what you're asking them to do? And obviously, you may get relationship issues, bullying and harassment. All of those things can affect somebody's state of mind, can affect somebody's performance, which ultimately will affect their attendance. So just sort of think about all of these things. A few tips there in terms of managing absence as a manager. So make sure your records are up to date. Keep your addresses, your phone numbers, your next of kin details. Again, we get lots of queries where somebody will ring up and say, somebody hasn't turned up to work today. What do I do? And the first thing we'll advise you to do is obviously contact them, contact their next of kin. So make sure you've got those details on file. And promote health and well-being within the organisation. Lead by example. Make taking lunch breaks normal. Make your return to work interviews normal. Take away that kind of fear factor around managing attendance. Make sure communications are open and set up a safe environment where people can speak. So, give people the opportunity to talk privately if they need to. Training and upskilling managers to spot the signs and have the conversation. So your managers being proactive around absence management. As we said earlier, carry out your return to work interviews and signpost professional services where required. In this one, it's really important to remember that you don't need to be an expert on everything. If you're dealing with somebody who, for example, has got problems with a mental ill health, you can refer those to professional services. People who have got a certain disability, you may want to refer to their own professional bodies or their own sort of charities and organisations. So sometimes with these meetings, it's more a case of listening to the member of staff and then say, look, I'm going to go away and come back to you with a plan of who you can contact, who you can talk to. But remember, you don't kind of need to manage all of this on your own. And then some steps to managing in sickness. So always have an informal meeting, always try and set an action plan where you can. So sometimes just pulling somebody up and saying, look, we're concerned about your absence levels. This is what they've been over the last few months. Is everything okay? Can sometimes be enough for somebody to get on top of things. If you need to go down a formal process, it's the same process as disciplinary. So somebody would need to go through a first, a final, a dismissal. Obviously, there are exceptions to that, and you may have cases where somebody cannot work again, and you might jump those early stages. Um, some companies will refer to this process as being a capability process rather than a disciplinary process, but it's exactly the same principles. Obviously, consider that you can get medical advice, so whether that comes from a GP or comes from occupational health, the person will need to consent to those, but that's always an option for you. And again, a question we get asked a lot there is, what if somebody doesn't consent? And the answer there would be you have to just make them aware then that you're basing any decisions on your own opinion and on what's based in front of you and not on any medical information. And as we said earlier, consider adjustments to work. Sometimes where people have something that perhaps makes it difficult for them to travel in certain times of day, or other things, a very small adjustment can make a really big difference. And then there's a graphic there which we sent around last week. So some of you will have already had this. If you haven't and you want it, just let us know. But just reminds you of the changes that are going on at the moment and kind of how you can manage them. So the changes to the SSP and the lower earnings limit, the fact there is a potential increase in sickness levels. Think about your own culture. Like we say, don't make return to work this big scary activity that everybody's dreading. Just make them normal. Think about your budgets and your planning and how you can transition over for those that cross over the 6th of April. And obviously make sure you are monitoring and managing sicknesses and having the data to do that, which is really important. Know why your people are off. Know if you've got a particular team that's off more than others or a particular manager who's got higher sickness in their teams. And it all gives you more support to manage them. Just a quick question in the chat. What if somebody wants an adjustment due to ongoing health conditions, but the employee won't take it on even through a reasonable adjustment? So if you are suggesting the adjustment as an employer, as in we think this might help you, obviously the employee doesn't have to follow that. All that you can do is recommend, offer, explain the benefits of it. Sometimes it's the other way around where the employee might be asking for an adjustment, but as an employer, you can't make that work. And in that case, I would say all of it comes down to communication. Explain what the barriers are, explain what the benefits are, document your conversation, because if ever they come back 6 months later and say, nobody's ever helped me, nobody's ever had this conversation with me, have it documented so you've got it as evidence. But ultimately, all of this kind of comes down to encouragement and recommendations, but you can't really force people to take the help if they're not ready for it or they don't want it. And that kind of comes back to a previous slide where we said about keeping the door open. Sometimes you might have a conversation with somebody now, but it's really not the right time for them to be talking about their health or talking about the concerns. But, 3 weeks down the line, they might be much more receptive. So just keep those kind of conversations going. That's the end of the training.